I discovered my grandson and his infant daughter living in a shredded tent under a freezing bridge, the wind cutting through the broken canvas as if it were paper. He stared at me in shock. After all, he had spent his entire life believing I was dead. I brought both of them aboard my private jet and took them home, and once we were in the air, I finally told him the truth about his father. The revelation shattered him, and he broke down in tears. Have you ever looked into the eyes of your own flesh and blood? A boy who carries your chin and your father's eyes, and seen not recognition, but the sheer, animalistic terror of a creature that has been hunted its entire life. That was the look my grandson, Leo, gave me when I peeled back the frozen, duct-taped flap of the tent he was shivering inside, a look that will haunt me until my last breath and serves as the defining image of the catastrophic failure of my own son. I had spent 3 weeks in a state of suspended agony, scouring the underbelly of a city that glittered with wealth on the surface but hid its rot in the shadows, guided by a private investigator named Vance, who charged me more per hour than most people make in a month, a price I would have paid 1,000 times over just to see that blue nylon fabric flapping in the bitter wind under the I-95 overpass. The temperature was hovering in the single digits, the kind of bone-deep cold that hurts your lungs when you inhale and turns your breath into jagged clouds of ice, and the wind was channeling through the concrete pillars of the bridge like a wind tunnel, cutting through my cashmere coat as if it were mere gauze. The stench was overwhelming, a mixture of exhaust fumes, damp rot, and human misery, but I didn't flinch. I couldn't, because there they were, my 20-year-old grandson and his 6-month-old daughter, huddled together in a nest of dirty blankets and scavenged cardboard, trying to share enough body heat to survive the night. When I stepped into the dim, flickering light of their battery-powered lantern, Leo didn't ask for money or food. He scrambled backward, crab-walking on the frozen mud, clutching the bundle of rags that held his daughter against his chest. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and rimmed with red, and when I said his name, a sound that felt alien in that frozen hellscape, he whispered a word that shattered my heart into dust: ghost. To understand why a boy I hadn't seen since he was 5 years old would look at a living, breathing man and see a phantom, you have to understand the architecture of the lie my son, Jonathan, had built, a fortress of deceit, constructed to hide his own narcissism and failures. Jonathan was a man who viewed people as assets and relationships as transactions, a trait that I had mistakenly nurtured by teaching him the ruthlessness of business, but failing to instill the morality that must govern it. 10 years ago, after I discovered Jonathan had been embezzling from the family trust, siphoning millions to fund a gambling addiction that was spiraling out of control, I made the hardest decision of my life. I cut him off, not from love, but from the money that was killing him, hoping that hitting rock bottom would force him to build a foundation of character. Instead of learning, Jonathan retaliated with a nuclear option I never saw coming. He viewed my boundary not as an act of love, but as an act of war. He took his wife and young Leo, moved across the country in the dead of night, and severed all contact, changing their numbers, their emails, and effectively vanishing into the ether. I hired investigators then, of course. I spent a fortune trying to track them, but Jonathan was cunning, moving frequently, living off cash, using aliases, and eventually, the trail went cold, leaving me in a silence that lasted for 15 years. A silence I filled with work and the gnawing, cancerous hope that one day they would return. I didn't know that during those lost years, Jonathan hadn't just hidden from me, he had erased me. He had told Leo that I had died of a massive heart attack when he was 6. He painted a picture of a grandfather who was gone and buried, a man who had left them with nothing but debt and enemies. He constructed a narrative where they were on the run, not because of Jonathan's gambling debts, but because of my supposed financial crimes. So when I stood there in the freezing mud, reaching out a hand that was shaking not from the cold, but from the adrenaline of grief, I wasn't just fighting his fear. I was fighting against a decade of indoctrination. I had to physically show him my ID. My hands were trembling as I fumbled for my wallet, pulling out my driver's license and holding it under the lantern light. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through photos of him as a toddler sitting on my lap at the beach house, photos Jonathan had likely destroyed years ago. I spoke in a low, steady voice over the roar of the highway traffic above us, begging him to trust the evidence of his eyes rather than the poison in his memory. I am real, Leo, I said, my voice cracking. I am here. I never died. I never stopped looking for you. It took 20 minutes to coax him out of that tent. 20 minutes of watching him weigh the impossibility of my existence against the certain death of staying under that bridge with an infant who had stopped crying hours ago, a sign of hypothermia that terrified me more than the screams. When he finally stood up, his legs trembling from malnutrition and the shock of the cold, he didn't hug me. He didn't smile. He simply handed me the baby, a silent surrender that said he had nothing left to give, that he had reached the absolute limit of his endurance. I wrapped that tiny, freezing child inside my coat, feeling her shallow breaths against my chest, and I put my arm around Leo's shoulders, guiding him toward the embankment where Vance had the SUV waiting, the engine running, a beacon of warmth in the dark. The drive to the private airstrip was a blur of high-heat climate control and heavy silence. Leo stared out the window at the passing city lights with the 1,000-yard stare of a soldier returning from war, his hands clenching and unclenching on his lap. He refused the protein bar I offered him, as if eating would break the spell and send him him back to the bridge. I didn't push him. I knew that the cognitive dissonance he was experiencing was a physical pain, a rewiring of his entire reality that required time I didn't have but had to grant. I watched him in the reflection of the glass, cataloging the damage, the hollow cheeks, the scars on his hands, the dirt ingrained in his skin, the oversized thrift store coat that offered no real warmth. It wasn't until we were aboard the jet, the engines humming a low lullaby and the cabin pressurized to a comfortable warmth, that the dam finally broke. We were 30,000 feet somewhere over the Midwest, escaping the storm front. The baby, Maya, was finally asleep in a specialized bassinet the flight attendant had rigged up, having taken a bottle of formula with a hunger that broke my heart all over again. Leo was sitting across from me in a leather seat that cost more than the house he had been evicted from, holding a cup of hot tea with both hands as if it were a holy relic. He hadn't spoken a word since the bridge. He looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed and sunken, and asked the question that hung in the air like smoke, his voice raspy from disuse. "Why didn't you come sooner?" Dad said. "Dad said you died owing the wrong people money. He said we were on the run because of your debts. He said if we ever contacted you or your associates, they would kill us." That lie, that specific, cruel, calculated lie, it was the spark that finally ignited the rage I had been suppressing since I found them. Jonathan hadn't just killed me off, he had martyred himself. He had painted himself as the victim of my supposed failures to justify the poverty, the instability, and the fear he had inflicted on his own son. He had used my death as a shield to cover his own incompetence. I set my drink down, leaned forward, and looked Leo in the eye, deciding in that moment that I would not protect the memory of a man who had nearly killed his own grandchild. I owed Jonathan no loyalty. I told Leo the truth. I told him everything. I started with the embezzlement, the millions Jonathan stole from the family accounts. I told him about the gambling addiction that consumed his father, the debts to loan sharks that Jonathan had actually incurred, not me. I told him about the intervention, the rehab we paid for that Jonathan walked out of, and the trust fund that had been waiting for Leo since the day he was born. A trust fund worth millions that Jonathan had tried to crack a dozen times using forged documents, and when he couldn't, he chose to punish me by stealing Leo. I told him about the investigators I had hired, the thousands of dollars spent chasing ghosts. I told him about the birthday cards returned unopened, the letters sent to dead-end addresses. I pulled up the bank records on my iPad, showing him the accounts that were untouched, the legacy that was his birthright, proving that we were not in debt, that we were not hunted, that the only person hunting them was the demon of his father's own making. I watched the realization wash over Leo's face, a slow, agonizing dawn as he recontextualized every moment of his childhood. He saw the sudden moves in the middle of the night not as escapes from my enemies, but as evictions. He saw the paranoia not as protection, but as guilt. He saw the refusal to let Leo have a phone or social media, not as security, but as a cage to keep the truth from getting in. The revelation shattered him, not because he loved his father. It became clear that Jonathan had abandoned Leo and the baby 6 months ago, when Leo's girlfriend died of an overdose, leaving them with nothing, but because he realized that his suffering had been optional. He realized that he had slept under bridges and dug through trash cans because his father loved his pride more than his family. He broke down then, a guttural, ugly sobbing that shook his thin frame, curling into a ball in the seat, grieving not just for the struggle of the last few months, but for the childhood that had been stolen from him by a lie. I moved across the aisle and held him, this grown man who was still a broken boy, feeling his tears soak into my shirt, feeling the sharp angles of his shoulder blades. I whispered to him over and over that it was over, that he was safe, that the debt was a fiction and the future was fully paid for. We sat like that for hours, the jet cutting through the night, while I silently vowed that if Jonathan ever showed his face again, I would destroy him with a thoroughness that would leave nothing behind but a cautionary tale. When we landed at the private airfield near my estate, the transition from the hell of the bridge to the sanctuary of my home was jarring, a sensory overload that I tried to mitigate by keeping the staff to a minimum. I had a doctor waiting, a discreet pediatrician named Dr. Aris, who examined Maya and confirmed that while she was malnourished and suffering from exposure, she would recover with proper care. Leo was in worse shape. His body was a map of neglect, an untreated infection in his leg from a rusty nail, signs of chronic starvation, dental issues that had been ignored for years. As I watched the doctor tend to him, cleaning the wound and hooking him up to an IV of fluids, I saw the physical toll of my son's vanity etched into my grandson's skin. The first night in the house, Leo refused to sleep in the guest suite. The bed was too soft, the room too big, the silence too loud. He slept on the floor next to Maya's crib, unable to let go of the vigilance that had kept them alive. I didn't try to move him. I grabbed a blanket and a chair, and I sat in the hallway outside the open door, keeping watch over the watchman, listening to the silence of the house and feeling the weight of the years I had lost. The legal war began the next morning, a preemptive strike to ensure that Jonathan could never drag them back into the dark. I had my lawyers file for emergency custody of Maya and a protective order for Leo, citing abandonment and endangerment. We froze every asset Jonathan might have had access to, ensuring he would be starved out of whatever hole he was hiding in. It didn't take long for him to surface. 3 days after I brought Leo home, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. I answered, and I heard my son's voice for the first time in a decade. He sounded rough, desperate, and arrogant. He didn't ask about Leo. He didn't ask about the baby. He asked if the rumors were true that I had kidnapped his family. He demanded a payout to keep quiet, threatening to go to the press with a story about an abusive, controlling grandfather stealing a child from a grieving father. I listened to his threats with a cold detachment, realizing that the son I had mourned was long dead, replaced by this creature of appetite and malice. I let him finish his rant, and then I spoke. "Jonathan," I said, my voice flat, "this conversation is being recorded. The police have already been notified of your location based on the ping from your burner phone. You're in a motel outside of Reno. I have the hospital records of Leo's condition. I have the photos of the tent. I have your abandonment of a minor child. If you ever come within 1,000 miles of Leo or Maya, or if you ever mention my name to the press, I will not just cut you off. I will spend every cent of the fortune you covet to ensure you die in a federal prison cell. Do not test me. I have nothing left to lose, and you have nowhere left to run." He hung up, but the silence that followed wasn't the silence of victory. It was the silence of a severance, the final cutting of the cord that should have been cut years ago. The months that followed were a slow, painful process of deprogramming. We had to teach Leo that he didn't have to hoard food in his pockets, that the heat wouldn't be turned off if he took a long shower, that he was allowed to have dreams that extended beyond surviving the next 24 hours. There were days he wouldn't leave the house, terrified that they were coming for him. There were nights he woke up screaming, convinced the bridge was collapsing. But slowly, the light returned. We spent hours in the library, looking through old photo albums, proving to him that he had been loved, that he had a history before the lies began. I watched him bond with Maya, not as a desperate protector, but as a father, learning to laugh again, his face filling out, the shadows under his eyes receding. I hired tutors to help him get his GED, and we started talking about college, about a future where he could be an architect or an engineer, things he had dreamed of before survival became his only occupation. It has been 3 years since that night under the bridge, and the new normal is a life that feels like a miracle every single day. Leo is a sophomore at the university nearby, studying structural engineering, driven by a desire to build things that last, things that protect people from the cold. Maya is a chaotic, joyful toddler who calls me Pop Pop and has never known a day of hunger in her life, a fact that brings me a peace I cannot describe. We never heard from Jonathan again. The last I heard from the investigators, he was serving time in Nevada for wire fraud, a fate he chose with every lie he told. I am an old man now, and I know my time is limited. My knees ache when it rains, and my heart isn't what it used to be. But as I watch Leo teaching Maya how to build a castle out of blocks on the living room rug, the fire crackling in the hearth, I know that the legacy of the Hawthorne family isn't the money or the estate or the business. It is the truth that we survived the lie. It is the resilience of the boy who walked out of the dark and the vindication of the grandfather who refused to let the ghost remain a ghost. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories of rescue and redemption. And if you have a family member you've lost touch with, don't stop looking. You never know who is waiting for you to find them.